One hot Colorado evening in June 2007, 34-year-old mother Paige Birgfeld failed to return home to her 3 waiting children.
My biggest fear was that she was missing by force. Someone had to have kidnapped her or, absolute worst case, murdered her.
Nothing more was heard about Paige. There was no trace at all for another 5 years.
An agony, a time of agony for her parents and her friends, and indeed for the 3 children that she bore.
The investigation was complicated by the discovery of a side to Paige Birgfeld that few people knew about.
She was running what we would describe as an escort business.
One of Paige's clients was local mechanic Lester Jones, a man with a dark past.
He kidnapped his wife at gunpoint and then threatened to kill her, almost in the same way as he ended up killing Paige.
Lester Jones killed Paige Birgfeld after she refused to continue to provide him services that he wanted.
Lester Jones's desire to dominate women had cemented his place as one of the world's most evil killers. The disappearance of 34-year-old soccer mom Paige Birgfeld sent shockwaves through the isolated city of Grand Junction, Colorado.
Mesa County is rural Colorado at its roots. It's beautiful from canyons to rivers. It's wide open spaces. It's good folks that really care about each other, and they're hardworking people.
Local journalist Matt Kroschel began following the story in 2007 and would still be covering the case at its conclusion almost a decade later.
Stories about Paige Birgfeld and the disappearance were routinely on the local news. It was a story that everyone was talking about. And so not just the anniversaries of her birthday or when she was last seen, because they were uncovering possible sightings, or there would be information that remains were being discovered throughout the years.
The investigation is focusing on an escort business Birgfeld was involved in.
As the news stories swirled, the man everyone believed had taken Paige Birgfeld continued to live alongside the friends and family of the woman he'd killed.
Lester Jones worked in the community. He was a quiet man that kept to himself and a bit mysterious.
Prosecutors were certain Lester Jones had murdered Paige, but they had to prove it, and that would take 9 long years. This killer's story begins on March the 4th, 1951, 200 miles from Grand Junction.
Lester Jones has very little known about him from his early years, but what we do know is that he was born in Westcliff, Colorado. He had a brother and sister.
We know that he got married quite early, in his early 20s, and he had 2 sons. And that marriage lasted for about 20 years.
By 1996, Jones was running a car repair workshop in Hotchkiss, Colorado. That's where he first met a young woman called Lisa Nance.
Jones first met Lisa when she stopped in his car shop, and she was about 28 years old. He was 45. She was a single stay-at-home mother. She had 2 children of her own, and when she first met him, he was recently divorced. They had almost like a whirlwind romance.
She was, I suppose, swept off her feet. This was an amiable, cheerful, handsome, tall, big man who represented a little security. And she called him gentle and funny and good with her kids.
Within just 6 months of meeting him, Lisa married Jones.
People liked Lester Jones tend to try and speed things up when they first meet somebody. They want to get that commitment from them really quickly. They kind of tie them into that, and then they're trapped in it. And that's when the trouble starts.
Lisa reported that Jones was asking her frequently who she was with, who she was talking to on the phone, looking at her mail and bank statements, checking her phone records and logs, and asking her if she didn't report speaking to somebody that day. He was increasingly jealous and controlling, and then angry at her if she didn't report the right thing to him.
If you get into a relationship with somebody who is very jealous, there's the biggest red flag. You mustn't talk to other men. You mustn't dress like this. I don't even like it when you see your friends or you go out without me. These are massive, massive red flags that this person thinks they own you and they need to control you. And we definitely did see those behaviors in Lester Jones.
As time went on, Jones was not just controlling, he also became more and more untrustworthy and dishonest.
Jones was a private pilot. He had his own license and would use planes from time to time, and he would just be gone without notice and without telling Lisa where he went. So he would disappear for days on end. Lisa reported that he was a pathological liar and would have an answer for everything whenever she asked him where he was, where money was going to. Her wedding ring went missing, and she thought no one else could have possibly taken it, and yet he was the only suspect, and he denied it. So she was increasingly distrustful of him.
Lisa began to suspect that Jones was stealing her money to pay for sex workers.
What we don't know is how he was with those sex workers. He may have been controlling, abusive, violent. We don't know, but he was seeing them regularly. I think he was probably quite obsessive about that as well.
So Lisa takes her courage in her hands and asks him to leave. But that doesn't put an end to his manipulation of his now estranged wife. He starts to stalk her.
Stalking is very, very common after a relationship breakdown. The worst thing is if the stalking moves on to what we call reconnaissance. So then they're looking for opportunities for an attack.
One day in 1999, Jones took the opportunity he'd been waiting for.
One night, Lisa decided to invite a male friend over, and they were going to watch movies together. They were inside all night just watching TV, and at 4 a.m, he had to leave, and Lisa was going to go with him. And at that point, when they were driving away, Jones followed.
Lisa and her friend are in the car, and they're being trailed by Jones in his truck. They must have been terrified. I mean, headlights in the rearview mirror, the whole scenario. It's dark, it's late at night, early in the morning. Crikey. And Jones increasingly gets closer to them, and he forces the car off the road.
Lisa was actually trapped in the vehicle, and only her friend was able to get out. And so he tried to free himself and then get Lisa out. And as he was trying to do this, Jones pulls out a gun.
Her friend starts to run off to get help. Jones fires 2 shots at him, one of which grazes his head. He then points the gun at Lisa and effectively demands she get out of the car on his side and get into his car. It's a full-scale abduction.
Despite being in fear, Lisa somehow managed to calm Jones down and convinced him to pull over.
As they were leaving, she said she was going to stop and ask for a tow or service of her vehicle. And instead of calling a car repair shop, she called the police. And incredibly, police were able to respond quickly and rescue Lisa from Jones, who they arrested.
But the stalking didn't stop. Jones was bailed the following day, and just a few weeks later, he returned to try and finish the job once and for all.
Lisa is asleep, and she wakes up to find Jones sitting on the sofa in her living room.
He was staring at her with such a menacing, frightening look that she thought she was going to die. At this point, Jones forced Lisa into his vehicle at gunpoint.
For the second time in a month, Jones had pressured Lisa into a car against her will. But this time he wouldn't be tricked into pulling over. Instead, Lester Jones brutally beat his estranged wife before driving her into the remote mountains, further and further from civilization and any chance of rescue for Lisa.
This is him now in almost, we could call it a panic. I have got to get control back. I am not accepting this. I cannot take rejection.
Lester Jones actually took her out into a very rural part of western Colorado and threatened to kill her and bury her in a lake.
She must literally have thought that her life was going to end that night. Imagine what it must have been like. You've been threatened with a gun. He's been arrested. He's turned up again. He's threatening you again. He's going to kill you. He's going to dump you in a lake. But yet again, Lisa demonstrates an extraordinary ability to survive, to get out of the situation.
At this point, she said, but I still love you, essentially as a way to try to get him not to do this horrific thing to her. Jones responded, prove it, and wanted to essentially have her have sex with him to show that she still loved him. Lisa managed to convince Jones to go to a local motel, and as he went inside to get them a room, she again thought quickly and decided to jump in the front seat and take the car and speed off and basically save her own life.
She was able to escape, and Lester Jones was actually charged and sent to prison for that event.
Lisa heaves a sigh of relief because finally the nightmare of her stalker-stroke husband is gone, and she doesn't hear anything for some considerable time. In fact, Jones is released after serving half his 10-year sentence.
By 2006, 55-year-old mechanic Lester Jones had been released from prison for the kidnap and assault of his ex-wife, Lisa Nance. Now 60 pounds heavier and sporting a full beard, Jones had remarried and was living in Grand Junction, Colorado, working as a mechanic at a local car dealership. On June the 30th, 2007, the city was stunned when local mother of three, Paige Birgfeld, was reported missing. Her friend of 4 years, Barbara Campbell, knew it was out of character.
I was a good friend of Paige. Our kids were about the same ages and played together, so it made it easy for us to hang out, even though we were both busy all the time. Paige had a wonderful relationship with her kids. She just loved to be with her kids all the time, and she was just completely devoted. When Paige went missing, I was completely shocked.
Saturday, June 28th, she had driven from Grand Junction into the mountains, about 2 hours into the mountains to meet her ex-husband.
District Attorney Pete Houtzinger was central to the investigation into Paige's disappearance. She and ex-husband Ron Beigler had recently rekindled their romance and had spent the day together just before she vanished.
He was the last one to have seen her. She was last known to have been driving back from the Central Mountains towards Grand Junction when she disappeared.
When Paige went missing, she'd left her children with a live-in nanny. And it was the nanny, and indeed her 8-year-old daughter, who eventually reported her missing. They walked to the police station together. It must have been an extraordinary sight. The nanny and this little girl reporting to the police that Mummy had gone. Heartbreaking, really. Ron Beigler, her first husband, also rang 911 to report her missing.
Dispatch, this is Clint.
Yes, I need to talk to you about a missing person emergency.
Something is definitely wrong. She either got abducted or an accident. I think she got abducted. She had to. There's just no way. So something is definitely wrong here. And I'm really starting to panic.
Paige first went missing. The first thing that the police would consider, is this normal behavior? Would we expect this person to go missing? And Paige did not fall into that bracket at all. She had never gone missing before.
Paige would never leave without her kids. Like, she wouldn't just take off. So instantly I knew something had to have happened.
Just one day later, Paige's friends and family were given even more reason to panic.
Her car's found burning in a lot out west of town. I mean, what was pretty clearly right off the bat, an arson situation where the car had been intentionally burned.
Knowing that the car was burned was a really bad sign that she was probably not alive, that we weren't ever going to get her back.
The most logical reason from a law enforcement perspective that someone would try to set fire to a vehicle is to destroy evidence, to eliminate the potential of DNA or hairs or other evidence being recovered from that vehicle.
There are two interesting things about the car when it was discovered. One is that the driver's seat was pushed all the way back. She herself was only 5'4", so it would not have been her who had pushed that seat back. Secondly, in the boot of the burnt-out car, her day planner is found, with significant days torn out, including the day in which she disappeared. Clearly, with an attempt designed to conceal who she might or might not have been seeing.
Finding the missing mother's car was a breakthrough of sorts, but there was still no sign of Paige Birgfeld and no indication if she was dead or alive.
There were search parties, both organized by the sheriff's office and with civilian volunteers.
It was really hot in Grand Junction in the summer, going over 100 degrees. I volunteered to do the searches, as many wonderful people did. And we walked miles a day, just looking for any clue. And day after day doing searches, and we're not finding her. It just really kind of slowly trickled in that reality that we knew what we were looking for on the searches. We're looking for a dead body.
If she was dead, Paige had seemingly tried to give detectives a clue about what had led to her tragic fate.
Before long, a number of items were found along Highway 50, and it was sort of a trail of her belongings found more or less random places along the highway heading south towards Delta. Items from her checkbook, and then items that seemed to be torn out of a notebook, business cards, which at least suggested that she had been actively trying to throw stuff out a window or something along those lines. Maybe trying to leave a trail for people to be able to track.
While the search continued, detectives compiled a list of all the people who might want to harm Paige.
Investigators immediately zeroed in on Paige Birgfeld's ex-husband, Rob Dixon. He was the father of her kids.
Statistically speaking, it is likely to be somebody she knows. And statistically speaking, it's likely to be a partner or an ex-partner. So those people would most definitely be in the lens of the police as they started their investigation.
Paige had previously made allegations of violence against her second husband. But when Grand Junction detectives checked his alibi, he was quickly in the clear. Also under scrutiny was Paige's first husband, the man who dialed 911 to report her missing, Ron Biegler.
Investigators were also looking into Ron Biegler because he and Paige had met up hours before she was last seen. Those men were immediately questioned to figure out where they were and just how close they still were with Paige. Were their motives there? Investigators cleared Ron Bigler right away because they could see on the cell phone tracking data that he actually headed back towards Denver, the opposite direction from Grand Junction, while Paige's cell phone was headed towards the western slope.
2 suspects had immediately been ruled out. Then detectives uncovered a secret life that had brought many more men to Paige Birgfeld's door.
Paige had a double life. She was, yes, stay-at-home mother of 3, hard-working entrepreneur with little businesses, but she was also an escort. She ran an agency called Models Inc., and she rented herself out as well. She was known as Carrie to the agency. She was expensive. I mean, $2,500 for a night.
She had advertisements in papers and on the internet offering massage services to people who wanted to hire her or her co-workers. And as the investigators dug into it, it turned out there were quite a few customers, and she was considered in that world to be highly desirable and successful as an escort. A very attractive young woman, well-groomed and pretty.
She was just very scrappy. I mean, she would do whatever and just try to make ends meet any way she could. And it wasn't until much closer to when she disappeared the first time that I had a conversation with her, and she revealed that, well, I'm also doing this escort service thing.
Next message.
Yeah, this is Jim. Just calling to see if Carrie was available tonight. You can call me back.
Once investigators started to figure out the other businesses, the side hustles that Paige Birgfeld had going, it complicated this entire case. Because now we know that Paige was having correspondence and messages and meeting with a lot of different guys that probably didn't want anyone to know they were meeting.
Many of Paige's clients had left voice messages on a cell phone she used exclusively for business, including a man calling himself Jim.
Next message.
Yeah, this is Jim. Just being impatient. I just dug out my room. Give me a call back.
Then there were at least one, if not more, calls from an unidentified track phone.
Next message.
Yeah, this is Jim. Could you give me a call back? 719.
Jim had been the last person to call Paige on the night she disappeared. When detectives got hold of her phone records, they discovered that Jim was not his real name.
The investigators were able to identify that phone, identify when and where it had been purchased, and identify security film footage of Lester Jones purchasing that specific phone on that specific day.
Standing tall at 6'4", local mechanic Lester Jones had not only been identified as the man on the footage, the 56-year-old was also well acquainted with the part of town where Paige's car was discovered.
The place where Paige's car had been found, having been set afire and burning, was within 100 and 150 yards from Lester's workshop there at Bob Scott RV.
Jones, the man known to Paige as Jim, was suddenly the prime suspect in her disappearance. He was the last person known to have spoken to Paige Birgfeld, and Jones's home life was far from perfect.
He was married and had, I guess, a somewhat interesting relationship with his wife. It wasn't all flowers and roses. They certainly seemed to go through good times and bad times. And his wife told investigators there were times when he would disappear and she didn't know where he was.
Just as he had with his ex-wife Lisa Nance, Lester Jones was disappearing to spend time with sex workers and escorts. One of the escorts he'd been seeing regularly was missing mother of 3 Paige Birgfeld. Jones had used the name Jim when contacting the 34-year-old.
Next message.
This is Jim. I tried calling you last night. Maybe I left the wrong impression on you. I do want you to call me, but it's been like since last night.
End of message.
Jones had developed an obsessive interest in Paige. Before her disappearance, she'd become concerned about his behavior.
One of her co-workers or friends had told the investigators that she was kind of creeped out or worried about this particular one of her clients.
Paige had told her friend of a white truck that would show up late at night when she was leaving work, circling the car park. On one occasion, the driver had even tried to block her in.
There are things about escort work that are inherently dangerous. You know, if somebody wants to kill a woman, they've got to get that woman on her own with them somewhere where there's no witnesses. That is an incredibly difficult thing to do. But if you go and see an escort, that is what they do. They have to do that. These people, these predators, have instant access to them.
Sometimes people feel empowered to treat women like horribly because they think they'll never go to the police and report it. And unfortunately, that does make sex work a riskier endeavor than other types of professions.
It was work that brought women like Paige into close contact with men like Lester Jones.
I think he was obsessed with Paige Birgfeld. I think Paige was by far the most desirable or an attractive escort he'd ever been lucky enough to hire.
The feeling was not mutual.
One of the times that he had tried to hire her not long before her disappearance, she had tried to direct that business in another direction to one of her coworkers because she didn't want to have anything more to do with the person who was driving that white truck.
As investigators uncovered Jones's criminal history of abducting and assaulting women, they began to wonder if history was repeating itself. They needed to find out if Jones had arranged to meet Paige Birgfeld the night she disappeared.
Jones is arrested and interrogated. He simply says, yes, of course. Help yourself. Here's my DNA. I'm happy to give you fingerprints, not a problem.
He did not deny that he'd been a client of Paige's and had contact with her, knew who she was, and used escort services.
Lester Jones confirmed to investigators that on the night Paige vanished, he was in the Grand Junction area.
He was in town, and his wife was out of town, as I recall at the time. He was in the area. He didn't have an alibi. He couldn't establish that he was out of the vicinity or couldn't have committed the crime.
When investigators got a search warrant, they went to Lester Jones' workplace. And at his workstation, they found some really weird stuff. They found some wigs. They found a wrapper for a track phone.
Track phone or these other types of, burner phones are ones where you can purchase it with cash. There's no long-term plan associated with it. And so you can have it and not have any details of who owns it, who's paying for it.
As the search at Lester Jones's workplace continued, more evidence linking him to Paige's disappearance was discovered.
Some accelerants, some things that could have been used in a kidnapping or could have been used in potentially burning the car.
Detectives also found a notebook detailing all of the escorts Jones had met with, describing them by height, weight, and cup size.
In other words, they reveal that this apparently normal, superficially charming man is actually obsessed with sex workers.
Lester had an active interest in pornography. His wife told us about that. He had a lot of pornography on his computer at work, as I recall, but also on their home computer. It's one more thing that makes you think, geez, this is somebody who could commit a crime like this.
Jones denied meeting Paige the night she disappeared, but the last calls to her cell were from the phone he'd been seen buying, and he had left messages under his fake name.
Next message.
Hello, yeah, this is Jim. Yeah, this is Jim, just being impatient. I got my room. Yeah, hello, Models Inc., this is Jim. Yeah, this is Jim, just calling, let me know, 719.
Investigators were convinced that Jones had tricked the young mother into meeting him before Paige had vanished. But armed with only circumstantial evidence, getting justice for Paige was not going to be easy.
There was a ton of pressure on investigators in Mesa County to press charges.
Within, I want to say, months of Paige's disappearance, we had largely honed in on Lester Jones as the most likely person to be responsible for her disappearance. The problem that I saw from that time right up through the end of the investigation was the fact that there were other clients of hers who it was hard to absolutely eliminate as potential suspects in her disappearance, and B, we didn't have a body.
A defense attorney can argue, at least to a reasonable doubt level, that there wasn't even a murder that took place.
Because of her double life, because of the fact that all the people who loved her and knew her well knew nothing about this double life and her secret business as an escort, I thought that was just too big a hole in the case to ever be able to prove Lester Jones's guilt or anyone else's beyond a reasonable doubt.
Paige Birgfeld remained missing, and investigators had no evidence to prove she had been murdered. No suspect will be charged with any crime relating to her. The news was a bitter pill to swallow for Paige's friends and family.
I was devastated after finding out that she was missing and realizing, as much as I wanted to believe maybe she could be found alive, that the reality was she probably wouldn't be. There's a lot of numbness to it because there was no answer. We didn't know that she was murdered, and that's a really difficult place to be in.
It was long, it was drawn out, and the family must have suffered dreadfully over those years. They must have felt at times that they were never, ever going to get the answers that they needed, that they wanted. And it was very difficult for the police, I think, who would be wanting to give them those answers.
Paige's father, Frank Birgfeld, had made regular, repeated trips to Grand Junction in an effort to find the missing daughter, but without any success. It's every father and mother's worst nightmare that their daughter should disappear into thin air and no body be found. It's heartbreaking.
5 long years passed with no closure for Paige's loved ones. And all the time, Lester Jones continued to live and work alongside the innocent people of Grand Junction.
By probably 2010, 2011, the investigation had somewhat ground to a halt, much to the frustration of Paige's family and loved ones, particularly her father, Frank Birgfeld.
Frank Birgfeld was just a really great guy. He was positive and always seemed to believe that the truth would come out, whatever that was. He wanted closure for their family.
When closure came, it was in the most heartbreaking of circumstances.
In March of 2012, a hiker in kind of a canyon area out in the desert stumbles across what the hiker believes to be human remains. And within a couple of hours, there were dozens of investigators from the state of Colorado and local jurisdictions scouring this desert area in remote parts of western Colorado.
I remember to this day getting the call from the sheriff's office saying, "We've found skeletal remains in the desert out by Delta. We think it may be Paige's," and thinking that could be the break that the case needed.
A skull was found at first. Then, as crime scene officers investigated further, they unearthed more and more bones.
Forensic analysis established, yes, that was in fact Paige Birgfeld's remains.
The bones buried in a creek bed for years before being washed out by the rain told a horrifying story.
The skull had duct tape wrapped around it, clearly as though her mouth had been taped shut.
I don't think the coroner was able to absolutely determine a cause of death. Simply, cause of death was homicide, and the most significant findings from her remains that I recall were the fact that there was a fracture to her skull that appeared to be contemporaneous with the time of death, and some duct tape remains that appeared to be consistent with her having been restrained, which is consistent with having been kidnapped.
The news was a devastating blow to Paige's family and friends.
Finding her remains really was an element of sadness. It just crushed all hope that she could come back. It just brought it all back up, all of that devastation. But this time it was, she really is dead. There is no hope now.
Though incredibly tragic, the discovery of Paige's remains brought District Attorney Pete Houtzinger one step closer to charging Lester Jones with her murder.
Of particular interest in Lester Jones's case were the facts surrounding his prior conviction for having kidnapped his second wife. I think the fact that Mr. Jones went to the time and trouble to buy a track phone, that Paige, when she got a call from that track phone, wouldn't know that it was the same client that she'd been troubled by in the past, shows a level of premeditation and planning. The fact that when Paige's remains were found, there were traces of duct tape attached to the skeletal remains, also is evidence of premeditation and planning, because he came equipped with what he needed to tie her up and restrain her and enable him to take her away.
In November 2014, Grand Junction detectives were finally ready to make an arrest.
It was breaking huge news in Western Colorado and really across the country. So many people were following this story when investigators finally made an arrest, and they arrested Lester Jones and charged him with murder.
In July 2016, 9 years after Paige Birgfeld went missing, Lester Jones went on trial for her murder at Mesa County District Court.
Lester Jones entered a plea of not guilty, meaning that the obligation of the district attorney is to prove the case to 12 jurors beyond a reasonable doubt. It was a circumstantial case where layer upon layer upon layer had to be proven to the jury, including the track phone evidence, the evidence from the burned vehicle, the evidence from Paige's belongings being found along the highway headed down south towards Delta, towards the site where she was actually found buried years later.
Despite the evidence against him, Jones appeared stoic in the courtroom.
Lester Jones didn't show much emotion. He sat on the defense side. He would look straight ahead.
The courtroom was the first time I actually set eyes on Lester Jones, and it was staggering to know that there was a very high likelihood that he killed one of my best friends. I've watched courtroom shows, and there was just nothing like sitting there knowing that this man that I'm in the same room with is someone capable of such a terrible thing.
Jones may have seemed confident, but investigators had an ace up their sleeve.
The prosecution's star witness in this case against Lester Jones is actually Lester Jones' ex-wife, Lisa Nance.
You know, she was scared of Lester Jones, and testifying against him had to have been difficult for her.
It was really sobering to think that a person who killed my best friend was married and, had been married before. It seemed that at least at some points in the relationships, he was a pretty awful husband. He just seemed to not be a very nice guy.
Despite the brave testimony of Lisa Nance and the compelling evidence against him, there was still a chance Jones could get away with murder.
After dozens of witnesses, the jury got this case but they could not come back with a verdict. They were deadlocked at 11-1. According to the people that were in the room, they were just unable to convince one member of the jury to find Lester Jones guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. So the judge had to call a mistrial.
It was just really devastating that he could potentially walk free. Like it was really scary to know that we have a killer on the stand. And so when he got off, it was like a gut punch.
Just 3 months later, prosecutors had the opportunity to make their case against Lester Jones once again.
I 100% feared that he was going to get off with no punishment. And he would get to walk the streets while my friend, who was a fabulous, vibrant, positive contribution to society, who bent over backwards to do things for her kids and her friends, she was dead. And he would get to continue. And I know life's not fair, but that I completely feared that was going to be the outcome.
I've been doing this for 35 years and I will never guarantee anybody what a jury's going to do. So I was certainly relieved and gratified when the second jury came back guilty beyond a reasonable doubt and unanimous.
On the 27th of December 2016, District Judge Brian Flynn sentenced Lester Jones to life in prison without parole.
It's like you're just holding your breath for years, waiting to find out. Like, is somebody going to be punished for this? Because it didn't bring Paige back, and that's the worst thing. But, a killer was punished. There's just got to be something good in that.
It took 9 years for the family of Paige Birgfeld to finally get justice for her murder. All the while, Lester Jones remains silent.
I'm not sure if we'll ever figure out exactly what happened to Paige Birgfeld. It would take the person convicted in her death to decide to start talking before we get any more information about what happened that night.
I remember Paige for how just profoundly kind and energetic and fun she was. She was always laughing, always having a good time, tried to always see the bright side of things. And I just hope everyone can know her for that.
The disappearance of Paige Birgfeld shocked and terrified the people of Western Colorado for 9 long years. The tragic mystery was finally solved when Lester Jones was convicted of her murder. But his brutal actions would have come as no surprise to the other women who had the misfortune to cross paths with Lester Jones, a man who violently refused to take no for an answer, and one of the world's most evil killers.